Thank you for the honor, but honestly, I'm here to honor you, the competitors this year. Honestly, you're all winners, and that needs to be said. If it's not going to be said later, let's acknowledge right now all of these folks. So, and I need to say too that UNH and the various institutes who have organized this are also winners. This is not optional, discretionary stuff we're doing here. This is essential stuff. This idea of business or enterprise with purpose is absolutely critical. The bad news is, we've really kind of screwed up the planet for you all. I'm talking to the students here. The good news is that there's unlimited opportunity in turning it around. And I'm going to try to talk to you about some stories along those lines. The legendary industrialist J. Paul Getty, who in my day was the richest man in the world, you'd be amazed at how few zeros there were next to his name compared to some today. He once said that my formula for success is to rise early, work late, and strike oil. It's actually sort of a sad, it's obviously true in his case. And while this principle that he espoused both sort of literally and figuratively has inspired generations of 20th century and even 21st century business people and investors, and continues to obviously guide much of our commerce today, most rational thinkers, and I think that we've got a group of rational thinkers right here, understand that the failed legacy of this kind of thinking and approach in which financial success becomes the singular goal with no regard for consequences is over. I mean, that's what's gotten us into this mess, this idea of ignoring externalities. May we all strike oil, but may it be the renewable kind and sustainable kind. If I could sort of put it differently, I think that for generations now, we've really confused the accumulation of capital or of wealth as the end goal, when in fact it's the means to the end goals. And I think that's what we're here to celebrate and talk about. And this is, of course, far from modern society's only blind spot. I began this journey, like many of you, especially you all over here, with the recognition that we've really evolved with a kind of a flawed path in terms of our relationship to the planet and ultimately to each other. It was a path that's really based on myths and mythical foundations to our commerce. The myth, for example, that waste is an acceptable byproduct of our economic activities. Waste, we're the only species who allows ourselves to do this, to produce this thing called waste and that toxifies or pollutes. Most other species recognize that in order to exist, waste has to be food, and that's how nature works, but we've somehow exempted ourselves from that. The myth of a place called Away, where we send our waste, and if you ever have figured out where that place is, I'd love to know. I've been looking for it my entire life, but climate change is a testament to the fact that there is no place called Away. We send it up our smokestacks, and it's here, and it's not going anywhere, and it doesn't matter whether carbon or methane go up in Beijing or Boston, we're stuck with it. The myth that the earth is infinitely resilient to handle whatever abuse we're heaping out on it. And also the myth that the earth is a subsidiary of our economies, that we're somehow on top of it. When in fact, the complete reciprocal is actually the truth, which is that everything that we do, everything that we have, everything that we are, it has been made possible by a bountiful earth. We are the subsidiary of our earth, but we humans have kind of got it twisted. And then the myth that I alluded to a moment ago, this myth of externalities, this, folks who slept through your economics class will, just to remind you what externalities are, these are the direct consequences of our economic activities that, in fact, nobody accounts for on our income statement or our balance sheet. You don't see pollution, net carbon footprint, how many people have been put into poverty, whatever. You don't see these costs recorded in our income statements, but they're direct consequences of an unconscious business climate, and yet we don't measure it. And more importantly, we don't hold ourselves accountable for it. And in my mind, in fact, the history of commerce is really, if you look at it, and I promise you I'm not the most depressing person on earth, but I do need to say, it's a history of taking, of one gaining at the expense of others, usually many others, and certainly that includes not just people, but planet. And we've, of course, had amazing progress in modern society and through modern commerce, incredible achievements, but we now know that many of these are not sustainable, and that's really what Stonyfield was created to try to address. Winston Churchill had a great summary. He said, success is the ability to move from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. And I think that's, does summarize a sort of, by that measure, we've all been successful. But the key question that we started with back in the early 80s, which is now long ago, some of you, I'm sure, were not born then, actually a lot of you, was whether it's possible to create and conduct commerce in such a way that the stakeholders in the planet, all stakeholders in the planet, can actually win. And that was a, kind of a twisted, confusing thing to say back then. I always say that in our early days, we had a wonderful company, just no supply and no demand. Nobody kind of knew what we were talking about. But the answer, I can tell you today, and you certainly see it in this competition 32 years later, the answer to that question is, and there's plenty of wonderful peers in the sustainable commerce movement in general, have proven that the answer is an unequivocal yes. That you can have, all stakeholders can win. The planet doesn't have to lose. Other species don't have to lose. Other segments of our population don't have to lose. Organic, which we could not even use the word organic and industry in the same sentence when we started back then. This was sort of our teepee and our wet goat, and it was a kind of a different era. But now it's a $40 billion sector, and perhaps more importantly, it's a sector that's growing double-digit compounded growth rates now for about 16 straight years. And in fact, it's in many cases triple-digit growth, and in most cases, the limiting factor on organic is not demand, it's supply. It's getting enough farmers and enough farmland and keeping up, which is, again, where a lot of you come in, because we need to grow the next generation of supply here to keep up. Did you know, for example, 22% of America's carrots are now organic? Probably not. I mean, it's a real number. Now, the good news is it's a $40 billion sector. The bad news is it's only 4.5% of total U.S. food. But again, when you have double-digit growth year after year, and the other sectors are shrinking, which is the case, conventional food is largely shrinking, you can see that the opportunities are endless. And what we've proven, we, Stonyfield, and we, my fellow organic entrepreneurs, have proven that every stakeholder, our farmer partners, the animals, the topsoil, our employees, their families, our stockholders can win. Our farmers, we support 1,800 family farmers. The average herd size is 90 cows. You don't have to be huge to be successful. They get nearly twice the price going organic for their milk that they would get on conventional, and they also earn at the bottom line far more than their conventional counterparts actually receive. Our milk purchases alone this year will support over 200,000 acres of chemical-free farmland, just the milk alone. And of course, in the yogurt business, there's a lot of other ingredients in there, although we do like plain best. It's, besides being best for you, it's the most profitable. But on the milk front, this means that over 9 million pounds of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer have been avoided every time you buy Stonyfield, and I'm so glad to see it in the cafeteria around the corner. Thank you, UNH. We've avoided over 400,000 drug treatments to animals, antibiotics and synthetic growth hormone and so on. We avoid over 200,000 pounds of insecticides and herbicides. So this is real stuff, real positive, sustainable commerce. By the way, organic dairy cows live twice as long as conventional dairy cows, so the animals benefit. We're not just supporting current dairy farmers, but we're supporting the next generation. Fiona's on the board, and UNH is involved with something that Stonyfield and Danone have funded, which is an organic farmer training school at Wolf's Neck Farm in Maine, where we're growing the next generation of farmers. The average age of farmers in this country is 59 years old, by the way, average. And so we really need this huge opportunity. So if any of you don't win with your particular competition, there's an opportunity right over at Wolf's Neck, and we would welcome you. We, of course, also buy much more than milk. We buy over 30 million pounds of non-dairy ingredients. We have a program called Source Map, where you can go online and actually see where our ingredients come from. You can actually go right down to the ecosystems. Our organic bananas, for example, Ralph Carlson is here from Stonyfield. He's been overseeing a project where a cooperative of small farmers in a remote area in Caribbean, Costa Rica, are suppliers, and we're keeping over 100 families out of poverty and giving value to a whole agroecological approach that didn't exist before. And it's the opposite pole from the sort of intensive banana republic type of tradition that you have heard about. Our planet is, of course, a major stakeholder in all that we do. And we've attacked the environmental impacts of our processing in hundreds of ways that time won't allow today. But just by example, our wastewater, when we first had to build a wastewater treatment plant, because we do produce a certain amount of biological waste, we went to the local authorities and said, well, what should we build? And they said, you have to build this traditional aerobic facility where you break down the waste and then you produce sludge. And we found out that we were going to produce about a truckload of sludge every single week. And when we asked the local authorities what we do with the sludge, they said it's really easy. You send it to Vermont, which was their kind of definition of a way. And I was picturing Ben and Jerry's, sending their sludge to New Hampshire and thinking, well, maybe we could meet in the Connecticut River and do sort of a sludge swap. But instead, we said, why not? And with the leadership of my sister and some wonderful folks at Stonyfield, we took a hard look at creating a truly ecological approach and instead built an anaerobic facility that produces a truckload of sludge about every 5 years. It is a system that uses the waste and puts that waste into something usable. We make electricity, we make heat, and in fact, we're mimicking what goes on in nature every single day, just not releasing it and certainly not sending our sludge to our friends in Vermont. We asked ourselves the question, is it possible to build a biological plastic instead of a fossil fuel one-way street with plastic? And indeed, every multi-pack cup that you see with Stonyfield is a plant-based polymer. It's made from plants. It happens to be made from corn, and we're working on the next generation of plants. But it was a simple question like you all have asked of why not that led to this pursuit. And it turns out there's no reason why not. We can do it. It's stronger, it's more durable, and it is dramatically lower in terms of carbon footprint. We have committed ourselves to shipping to the western United States by rail, and this has saved us millions and millions of dollars. Of course, millions and millions and millions of pounds of CO2. Our fundamental model has been beneficial to our investors. Another obviously key stakeholder who you have to, thank and honor. Thank you, Mom, by the way, for that. But really, we invented a consumer products model that is fundamentally, at the time, it was thought to be completely foreign. Our because we believe actually in investing in our farmers and investing in topsoils and putting back and not just taking and not just going for the lowest cost, which ends up getting a lot of shortcuts and a lot of economic and more importantly, environmental inefficiencies. We pay more, and most of what we pay, I already told you, we pay twice as much for our milk. We can't charge twice as much for our yogurt. So we have a model in which our gross margin, that is after our cost of goods, it's a whole lot lower than our conventional counterparts. I can tell you, it's 1,000 basis points. It's 10 points worse at the back of our factory. So we're at a deficit already to our competitors. And yet, at the bottom line, down at the net line, we've got the same profitability as them. And so something happened between the gross margin line for you business students and the net margin line, and that is that we didn't spend as much on advertising. As a matter of fact, we spent kind of a rounding error on advertising. And instead, our idea of advertising has been to support hundreds and hundreds of nonprofits and eco-organizations and build a rapport and build a connection with consumers. And that has led us to find new ways, new channels to spend less on advertising, but build ultimately the holy grail of consumer products, which is loyalty. Loyalty gets you word of mouth. Loyalty means the consumer who tried your product is going to come back. I'll tell you the anecdote that proves this. was standing in Florida quite a long time ago now, at a public supermarket holding a competitor's yogurt, and I was reading the ingredients on it, and a little old lady came up and tugged me. I shouldn't say little old lady anymore, she's probably my age now. But she came up and tugged me on the elbow and said, "Young man, somebody your age really should be eating the Stonyfield instead of that stuff." This is a true story, it really happened to me. And I went on to ask her, well, why? Why eat the Stonyfield? She said, well, do you know they give 10% of their profits to environmental causes, they measure their carbon footprint, they started iterating all this stuff. And I said, well, how do you know this? And she said, well, she started to tell me this long story. And she, by the way, I'm a total stranger. I wanted to hire her on the spot, I should say. But she told me about her husband who had died 6 months earlier from colon cancer, and she had a granddaughter graduating high school, and she wanted to be around to watch her granddaughter go to college and go on in life and start a family. And so she and the girls, she called it her Bridge Club, had decided to start really reading labels seriously, to look at what these products are and who the companies are and who's behind it. And we know this today. Look at what's going on with the local and sustainable movement. I mean, millennials do not need to be lectured on this, okay? It's us older folks who are catching up. But people want to know and have the right to know what's behind and to make that kind of choice. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. But the point is that that's loyalty, and that comes about not from paying some celebrity to run fancy ads. You'll be relieved to know you don't have to spend that kind of money. It comes from doing the right thing and talking about it and getting others to talk about it. The nonprofit causes who we have benefited, who we have supported as part of our partnerships, including, for example, the UNH Organic Dairy, which is a major benefactor of Stonyfield's support, but hundreds and hundreds of eco-organizations. That stakeholder community has benefited by our decision not to spend money on expensive advertising and instead to engage with them. Our employees, of course, critical stakeholders. We have created wellness credits. I'm incredibly proud. You may have seen the news that Stonyfield is now one of the first in the country to announce a 6-month maternity leave. That was just recently announced for our employees. And by the way, I need to say credit goes to Danone, the owners of Stonyfield, who really helped to advance this idea as well. So it wasn't just the crazy entrepreneurs, it was actually this very large company who recognizes that it's time to do things differently. On the way growing up, the way that we grew the company is with profit sharing, an open book still today. We still have monthly meetings where companies see the entire P&L. This idea of keeping the numbers a mystery has always mystified me. We had equity participation and other kinds of awards. Our retail partners have obviously, our critical stakeholders, the people who are between us and all of you. But again, I told you, they've enjoyed double-digit growth commerce here. They will tell you organic and non-GMO are the growth. And that's why you see larger and larger companies getting into the space, and it's why you see more and more space being dedicated to this area. And of course, our consumers, ultimately, the ultimate stakeholder, the people who we work for, the people who make this possible. And I don't need to tell you that, the President's Cancer Panel tells us that 41% of Americans alive today are going to be diagnosed with cancer in our lifetimes. That's 1 in 2 men, 1 in 3 women. And this panel of oncologists, not ecologists, implicate as a cause of this trend. And I know it's a shocking statistic. When Ronald Reagan, by the way, first convened this panel in the 1980s, that number was 20%. So in one generation, we've doubled the percentage. And who knows what it's going to be when President Clinton takes office here shortly. The reality is that this oncologic panel implicated toxins, inadvertent exposure to everyday toxins as the principal cause, and used the President's Cancer Panel report to beg our president to use the power of his bully pulpit and the agencies to reduce the inadvertent exposure to toxins in everyday life to average folks. So again, producing products that you can feel good about, that are chemical-free, that are produced in a way that supports family farmers, that puts resources back into the earth, that sequesters carbon and so forth. that's a win for us all. Now, I want to be clear, and I especially need to say this to the entrepreneurs in the competition, that obviously this was no walk in the park. And in the early days, we were clueless. Just, you need to understand, we had no idea. Our assets when we started were 7 cows, a couple of used desks from the Army surplus, and a rented farm, 3 wood stoves, and my partner's kids, and a great yogurt recipe. That was literally it. So that's why Mom came in handy. Literally, the first day at work, I discovered that we were $75,000 in the hole on day one. So like any self-respecting entrepreneur, I called, what do? You call Mom, right? And borrowed some money, which thankfully in the long run has worked out. But in those early days, you should understand, we had this incredible yogurt recipe. Our whole thing was that it had to be superior. We knew if it was the same as what's out there, it was no matter what our values were. If people put their, I always say we can ship the yogurt 3,000 miles, but it's the last 18 inches that really counts. And as people lift that spoon to their mouth, if they have a negative experience with your product or your service, that's it, right? It's over. And the evidence of this paradigm working is that the older folks in the room will remember that in the early 80s, we had the Iranian hostage crisis on the front page of the news every day, and Ayatollah Khomeini was screaming, down with America, and we were the evil empire. And an Iranian refugee had resettled in Milford, New Hampshire, right next to us, and she drove up to the farm one day and said, this yogurt is incredible. I had to see the people making it. And they know a little bit about yogurt in Iran, right? They've been eating it for sort of thousands of years. And she said, this is the best thing I've had in this country since I left the old country. And she said, I've come up here with a piece of advice for you. You should call it a taste of Iran, which was advice we did not use, but it was wonderful accolade nonetheless. But we were, the superiority of the product was key to everything I'm talking about. I would not be standing here without my partner's amazing recipe. But I will tell you that because we had an amazing product, this gave us license to market ourselves and grow our business in ways that were really less expensive. When we sat at the major supermarket chain, which at the time was Demoulas Market Basket, and he said, well, what are you going to do for advertising? We had no money for advertising, this very expensive custom-made, handcrafted yogurt. And on the drive back, we realized we didn't have money for advertising, but we did have cows. So we decided to put cows up for adoption. And in those days, what would happen is you could send in 5 yogurt lids, and you would get a certificate naming you the co-owner of your cow, and then a photograph of your cow. And then in those days, the cow would send you 2 letters per year. And the letters would talk about all kinds of interesting things like methane and organics and why we're doing all this crazy stuff. They're extremely intelligent cows. But the point is we built loyalty out of our sort of ingenuity and also out of our necessity. And that's really, the key to us standing here today. And of course, we sampled the daylights out of the yogurt. So every nuclear protest, every road race we could go to, every cause we could support, we were out there sampling. And again, honestly, that's how it got built. I want to tell you, every once in a while, by having something better, we had good luck, and many of you will find this will happen to you. One day, for example, a couple of shock jocks on the radio in Boston were talking about our product. One guy was a sort of a heavy-set guy who was always bragging about how many Dunkin' Donuts he could eat in one sitting. And the other guy was this tall, lean guy who always bragged about running the marathon. And the lean guy was eating our yogurt one day on the air, and the other guy said, "What are you eating?" And he said, "I'm eating this incredible new yogurt from New Hampshire. You should really try this stuff." And the guy just spontaneously said, "I'd rather eat camel manure than yogurt." So Benson's Animal Farm still existed in Hudson at that time, and they had camels. And my wife and I early one morning with a full quart of yogurt for Joe, the athlete, and an empty quart for Andy, we went over to Benson's, and it was January, and we picked up a bunch of camel nuggets from the cage, and they were frozen solid, there's no problem. But of course, by the time we got to Boston, they had thawed, and the top of the yogurt container was sort of domed, and we had no appointment. We just walked in, and the receptionist said, "Well, what are you doing here?" And we said, "Well, we're here to provide breakfast for Joe and Andy." And she said, well, you don't think you can just walk in, dude? And we said, no, but we're hoping you'll let us. And then I cracked this thing, and the vapors filled the room. And she said, whatever you do, just get out of here. And she buzzed us through, and we went into the producer, and he loved it. So to make a long story short, we did get our first celebrity endorsement. He did agree our yogurt did taste better than camel shit. So it was a big day for us. So again, I offer this lesson that, you may not have the deep pockets, but take advantage. These opportunities will come. The sort of next phase of our business, by the way, I could regale you for hours with those stories. And, this is what you do, right, to get your business started. But let me just jump to the next phase, which is sort of 9 years later when we were finally making money. And I want to say that again, it took us 9 years to make money. So you look at Stonyfield as this big success. You've got to understand we did not make money. We were totally dependent on individual funders. No institutional investor would give us the time of day. I had institutional investors in those early days with their feet up on the desk. Literally, one guy clipped his fingernails while we had a meeting where I was asking him to invest in us. So, they treated us pretty arrogantly. Of course, the vindicating time came later when, we had hit it and they were all trying to get in, and I didn't clip my fingernails with them, but I was sure tempted to. But in any case, 9 years into this thing, we were at about 10 million in sales, and that's where we really began to take off and grew to the almost $400 million today. But you should understand that everything I've just shared with you, this notion of win, 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 were the elements, were the fabric that were in the threads in the quilt that made us successful. Nancy here, my sister, started something called the Mission Action Program at Stonyfield, which was a program of many teams that were focused on all the different footprints in the company. We had a toxins team, a water team, an energy team, a methane, and so forth. And what you need to know is that we had incredible achievements across those teams. I told you the shipping to the West using trains instead of trucks as an example. But what you should really understand is that from 2006 to 2012, the first 6 years of these teams, it saved us $35 million. So this is not theory. This was not just values. This was not just, what is Gary smoking back there? This is, the real deal. We were producing real dollars to our bottom line, which of course became our internal source of venture capital needed to fund the kind of innovations that you've heard about. And this, of course, even after being successful, even having money, I still was at a deficit, a disadvantage to our competitors. Our product still cost more. I still could not charge, and that's still to this day. Stonyfield still can't, doesn't have the gross margins. So we still had to use all kinds of innovative techniques. Another one that I love to tell about is we always used our lids, our yogurt tops, and still do, to communicate messages that we care about. One year, this backfired on us a little bit. Nancy Pelosi had become Speaker of the House, Carol will remember, and she demanded organic food in the cafeteria on Capitol Hill. We've been trying to get onto Capitol Hill for years, and so we finally arranged the shipment and we got it down there. But unfortunately, the week when our yogurt was shipped to Capitol Hill happened to be the week where I did an annual lid ranting about campaign finance reform. And the particular lid that week said, in politics, the cream doesn't always rise to the top, which was my way of saying you shouldn't have to be a millionaire to run for Congress, right? And let's get this woman reelected, by the way. But what I really loved about this story is that they rejected the yogurt, and with the return receipt that came back, they wrote a note on it, "Too political for Capitol Hill." I'll never forget that line. That was like the line when the Wall Street Journal rejected our essay on how addressing climate change can actually be profitable for business. And the chief of the Washington of the Wall Street Journal editorial board wrote, "Dear Gary, I love your yogurt. I eat it every day. I just can't stomach your views on climate change," and big rejection. But of course now they're acknowledging climate change. They are finally there. So we used all of these techniques. We saluted commuters around the country, stood at train stations and gave out yogurt to thank people for using public transit and the like. And these kinds of things that came from our value system and which we were acting on in our own business, so we had cred, were really, as I say, these were the threads that made this quilt. Which leads me to the last part and the final thing I want to share with you. And Michael, actually, without us even talking, kind of led us there in your very nice introduction, which is that, in fact, it's not enough, I've discovered, to build wonderful enterprises. And I know it's plenty. Believe me, I understand the incredible work. I hope you get it. 9 years of not making money makes you really old. I was 6'6" when I started, and look what's happened. But it really is not enough in these times to build great enterprises. And I began this by saying, this competition and all that we're standing for here is not optional. It is essential that we reward and acknowledge values-driven business, that business stands for something good, something restorative, stands for those who don't have a voice out there. And what I'm trying to say more simply is we have to be also involved in policy. It is not enough to just be on the sidelines building something and creating jobs, amazing as that is, important as that is. And this came home to me in 2011 when, to remind you what I said earlier, the President's Cancer Panel in 2008 had already said, we have a problem with toxins in this country, and we're getting sick. And believe me, for half of Americans having cancer, that's a multi-trillion-dollar economic impact, let alone the moral tragedy and the emotional tragedy. And they implicated toxins. And so in 2011, I was sort of very proud of this incredibly fast-growing organic segment and how big we'd become when I became aware of an herbicide-tolerant alfalfa getting approved through the federal government. And you may have seen some of the announcements that came out yesterday with genetically engineered salmon, that our federal government has sort of rubber-stamped these new technologies without necessarily looking at the broader consequences. And in this case, herbicide-tolerant alfalfa, and we know a lot about alfalfa in the dairy business, right? It's necessary for feed, was solving a problem that didn't exist. But Monsanto had developed an alfalfa that would, you could put as much herbicide as you want and it would not adversely affect it. And it got approved. And only like 7% of America's farmers were using herbicides. And when they were using them for about a week at the beginning of the season, because what you'd do is you'd put your seeds in the ground, you'd spray a little herbicide to kill off weeds so that by the time the little vulnerable shoots came up a week later, there was no competition, right? Because you'd killed off everything else. But the thought of using herbicides at other times of year was not something that was ever in practice. And what I learned is this herbicide, glyphosate, you would know it as Roundup, in the period from 1996 to 2011, when the first genetically engineered crops had also been introduced to be herbicide tolerant, that we had, in fact, increased our use of this glyphosate by about 500 million pounds. That 60 to 100% of the rainwater in the Midwest contains herbicides. And most recently, we knew at the time that there were problems with glyphosate. There was all kinds of scientific indications. There were meta-analyses showing that there's links with all kinds of cancers. But just recently, last spring, the WHO, the World Health Organization, declared that glyphosate is a probable carcinogen. So if I could summarize what I just told you with this kind of depressing news, and I'm in the business, right, and I'm learning this stuff in 2011, is that glyphosate use had grown as fast as the organic industry had grown. The same compounded growth rates from 1996 to 2011. Why is that? Because while genetic engineering may one day fulfill promises of higher yields and all kinds of advances, in fact, 90% of the crops that have been introduced in this country have been introduced to enable more herbicide use, 90%. And we shouldn't be surprised because these companies who've rebranded themselves as biotech are actually chemical companies, Dow, DuPont, and the like. So anyhow, I was sort of shocked by all of this. The problems are many. Again, I don't have time to go into. We've created a generation of overuse, like with antibiotics, overusing a formerly effective toxin, which was effective in small doses, but overusing it made it ineffective. We now have super weeds across the country on 60 million acres, 26 states. Weeds that one farmer told me in Arkansas that in his soy field that are 12 feet tall, the diameter of my thigh, his wrist. He said, the only way I can take these weeds down is with a chainsaw or machete. These are weeds that are grown resistant to using weeds. Nature doesn't wait around to do focus groups when it's under assault, like us humans. It just responds and mutates accordingly. And we now have this problem, which has led to even stronger herbicides being used. And so we have this chemical treadmill going on. And I'm very proud of our industry and our company and all that we've done. But I'm wondering, why is my country doing this? Well, come to find out, it's all happened. Everything I just described has happened without any of us being aware of it. I wasn't the only one. None of us were. And the reason we're not aware is that we don't have labeling of genetically engineered foods to know, to be able to vote, to be able to choose with our purchase dollars. When you run an item past a scanner, if I've learned nothing else, you're voting. You're voting for local or not, natural or not, herbicide tolerant, genetically engineered or not. So this is why I actually stepped out of the role of CEO at Stonyfield into this chairman's role, to create something called Just Label It with Nancy and many others. And it is now a major national force at the table as we're trying to work our way through a very difficult political environment to say, look, this matters. Consumers have this right. By the way, 64 nations around the world have labeling of GMOs, like really progressive countries like Russia and China give their citizens the right to know. And again, I don't have time to go into this in enormous detail, other than to say to you that literally right now, this would be a very good time to let our senators know, whatever state you're in, that you believe that you should have the right to know, a mandatory right to know. Because at this moment, the opposite is being prosecuted. And with this year's omnibus, this spending bill, there may be a rider attached to it that would permanently block our right to know. Right now, that's what the Senate is talking about doing, to permanently block and make voluntary labeling, in other words, at companies' discretion, the law of the land. So for 5 years, I've been working on this. We're at this pinnacle moment. This is a critical point. But my deeper point and my broader point to you is that, again, you should understand that all we're looking for is 2 words in the ingredient panel. And what you need to understand is that large food companies and chemical companies have spent, as of this moment right now, in the last 24 months, $200 million in lobbying to block our right to know. Okay? That's what we're talking about. So this is commerce not being used in a proper way, not being used to encourage sustainability. Our elections are sales nowadays, right? It's who has the most money, something that obviously has to be changed. But my real broader point is simply this, is that our enterprises are, of course, inherently political institutions, enterprises that are working on solutions that are saying, I can address a social or environmental problem, but we need to go beyond. We need to engage with policymakers. They should be funding and supporting the 21st century approach, not the old 20th century approach. And that's what Just Label It has been all about. So let me try to kind of conclude and tie all this very neatly together. As I've said, Stonyfield really, and the organic industry are really represent to me this model that we can have it all. Organics is preventative health care, cheapest form of health care there is, much cheaper than getting sick, right? That's it. Organic promotes brain development. We now know that. There's a link between pesticides and brain development, particularly for the very, very young. Organics promotes carbon sequestration. We all know. We now need to get it back out of the atmosphere and back into the soil. That's what organics does. Organics promotes biodiversity, more species. When you're not toxifying, you're building a healthy food chain so that the microorganisms can feed the macro and you can rebuild something. It supports family farmers. It keeps people on agriculture. It's more opportune for younger farmers because of the higher income. It's national and global security. It's less dependent on importing fossil fuels from places that are obviously war zones. It's an economic development driver for our nation, as you've heard, by the double-digit growth. It's a net contributor to export and to trade. And so, of course, it's not perfected yet. It's still food for the elite. It's still too expensive. And that is the final frontier. And we get there by having labeling, by being fully transparent about what the organic is the alternative to. And we get there with more volume. And that means that we need to, for example, have a level playing field, and this is where policy is important. We don't have subsidies in organic, but Carol will tell you there's plenty of subsidies on the conventional side. So again, it's why we need to be engaged in policy. So I say all of this to you by saying there's a very special power in business. There's a very special power. You know, contrary to our Supreme Court and the Citizens United finding that companies are people too, companies are not people too. Companies are more powerful than any of us as individuals. I know this. I've run one for decades. We have unusual reach. We have an unusual ability to affect our communities, to impact our policymakers, to impact the broader footprint of commerce. Pick your cause, and obviously all of you in this competition have, whatever it is, and stick with it. You will see, as we have at Stonyfield, that it has been a powerful, essential ingredient to our success. If I had just gone out to produce a better than theirs yogurt without the other focal points that I've talked to you about today, I would not be standing here. I would have, first of all, been outspent by them, as you can tell from my earlier story. Go the distance with it. Take your values all the way. Communicate openly about them. Maybe they'll irritate some people, but like my lids did on Capitol Hill. But in fact, most people at the end say they respected us for having a point of view and for being engaged and not seeing commerce as this cul-de-sac, this place that's off on the side, away from the mainstream of public discourse. So, you know, I end with two quotes for you. One that many have heard me say before, because I think it says it all, which was Gandhi's line. And he said, anyone who thinks they're too small to make a difference has never been in bed with a mosquito. And, you know, you may feel like a mosquito now, but there's power in what you're doing. And you just saw a wonderful testament, last year's winner. Look at what's unfolding here from the support that began right here on the stage and with this competition. And then the last one is a newspaper columnist who's a guy named Doug Larson, said some of the world's greatest feats were accomplished by people not smart enough to know they were impossible. And, you know, I think it's important to, you know, that line, impossible is nothing. It's true. We have to reinvent, you know, this is not a dead end that we've gotten ourselves into on so many of these areas. It's a cul-de-sac. And we can come out of it. And the way we're going to come out of it is with the kind of inspiration, the kind of passion, the kind of dedication that you've shown today. So I end where I began, with commending all of you winners today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gary. Gary would be happy to take a few questions, and there are volunteers with microphones. So wave your hand if you want to ask a question, and they will find you.
How about arguments?
Yep, down here. She's coming with a microphone. Thank you.
So you mentioned a lot about the successes you had, but what were the biggest challenges you had managing sustainability and corporate sustainability while managing growth?
Yeah, you know, three of them jump to mind, but I could spend another 2 hours with you answering that question. One was finding common ground with investors. And, you know, we were talking about things that people thought were distractions from our business, not our business. And therefore they thought that, you know, we were taking on too much. When in fact, I think I've proven to you that most of our sustainable investments were in fact enabling us to even be in business in the first place. And that leads to my answer, which is you just don't take no for an answer. Just stick with it. Just stay with it. I mean, I probably, you know, Ben will always tell the story of going to 21 banks before they found one. Now that one bank was their banker for the next 30 years. And did very well. And we went to many, many investors, and the ones we found, you know, finally did extremely well. But, you know, it was. I mean, I really do think that persistence is probably the most undervalued and essential ingredient to success in social enterprise or any enterprise. So that was certainly one. As I said, the cost of goods issue was really a problem and remains a problem. It's always a challenge. It's never solved. We are. The good news is that we have, you know, found this formula that can work. But, you know, the tough news is that supermarkets, in the end, you're occupying the same space as somebody who's, you know, maybe is buying the national advertising, is getting the quarterbacks or the models or whatever they're doing. And so you've got to really be adept and fast on your feet and diversified in all of your answers to that problem, which not the least of which is constantly attack your supply chain. Our view for cost and efficiency, but not at the expense of the farmer. And that's really the central message I have is, how stupid is it to screw the farmer who's actually making this work? And then, the third thing is, was that, we were asking questions for which there were usually not answers. And that's tough when you're responsible for people's jobs and livelihood. And, the CEO says, look, we've got to find a way to do this. Or we had just a mandate to find a way to do this because we had to stick with organic, and that means certain standards, certain shortcuts were not available to us. And you're staring at 500 people who are dependent on you, not to mention all the other stakeholders. And again, I would say that this comes down to a central point, which is that you got to really believe in yourself. There's no every single enterprise here has a completely unique ecosystem of problems and challenges. Mine are unique in our space, and 10 other companies will have 10 other unique ecosystems. But I think that the corollary of determination is that you've got to look in the mirror, and when everyone else thinks you're crazy, if you know that you're right, you got to stick with it. Now, okay, at some point, you've slammed yourself against the wall enough times. It's important to be a learning CEO. It's important to be a learning executive as well. But so much of what we're talking about is inventing new solutions and convincing folks who have a different way of thinking. I started at the beginning with the fundamental paradigm. So I think that's really what you have to draw upon. And that also means finding people, and I'm fortunate, I've got several of them right here in front of you, who are entrepreneurs in their own right, who are creative problem solvers, who didn't just take no or that's not possible as the first stop. And I think that's a governing paradigm. Yes, one last one and then I'll wrap? Yeah. I can hear you, yeah. Here's a mic if you, okay.
So I think the competitive instinct of entrepreneurs and enterprises can be to seek exclusivity or to protect what they know or what they're doing from others. And that doesn't really serve the greater goals of sustainability often. Certainly through your business, you are able to scale the impact with partnerships like Danone. But could you speak a little bit to not just from being a competitor for them to deal with, but how you worked within, say, the dairy industry or the organics industry to combat that instinct of exclusivity or competition to bring the industry along, not just the company?
Yeah, no, that's great. And my time is obviously short here. So I'll just say, I'm going to use the example I used earlier. When we addressed the question of this plant-based packaging, there's no way that our little volume was going to leverage that supply by ourselves. So Nancy and Rolf and the teams did an open source program inviting all of our competitors, our partner companies in under the tent to be part of the solution. Part of that was to validate the idea and show that it isn't just the crazy people in New Hampshire, which is, we had long since grown used to it. But part of it was a practical need to actually grow our supply. And, I just want to segue to say one last thing to that, but to make a broader point here. The partnership with Danone, which many of you are buying organic foods from larger companies now. Annie's is now part of General Mills. Honest Tea is now part of Coke. Stonyfield's part of Danone. I need to say that that's how we're going to change the world. Where not that selling to the large companies is the only way to do it, but the means and the resources that become available to you. The carbon footprint metric that Nancy established back in the early 90s, I think, or late 80s, has been adopted by Danone on a global basis. Every division on the planet has to now measure their carbon input, and as part of their annual performance, they have to show how they've reduced their impacts. And so this was taking our little idea and inspiration to a much bigger scale because we had the resources of a larger entity. So I want to be clear to say big is not always bad. Sometimes it is, often it is, but it's not always bad. And it's a question of hanging on to your values, and it's a question of your values making as much economic sense as value sense. And I hope if I've convinced you of nothing else today that that is entirely doable. That's what we're about to celebrate as we give out these awards. So thank you.